look deeper into the Scripture, we find a very clear answer to that question. Nowhere in the Bible is the seventh day ever called the Sabbath of the Jews. As a matter of fact, we just read the creation experience. Adam and Eve certainly weren't Jewish, and this is who the Sabbath was made for. Now you might say, Sam, I never read anywhere where the Sabbath was made for Adam and Eve. Well, actually we find that in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, and verses 27 and 28. Let's turn there together. Mark chapter 2 and verses 27 and 28. Here Jesus is speaking, and it says, "And he said to them, the Sabbath was made or created for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man, or Jesus, is also Lord of the Sabbath." So here very clearly Jesus, who we found is the Creator, is telling us that he made the Sabbath for man. And obviously the first man and woman who were on the earth were Adam and Eve. And so I find it very hard to believe that God didn't create the Sabbath day for his crowning act of creation, which was mankind. Another question that sometimes comes in is, I didn't think that the Ten Commandments existed before Moses gave them. Where is the law in the Bible before Exodus? That is a good question. But again, as we look a little deeper into the biblical concepts, we find that the law is actually very present. We'll find that the law in the Bible always points out sin. Matter of fact, the very definition of sin is found in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4. It says that sin is, or sin equals, the transgression or the breaking of the law. And so Romans 4:15 tells us, where there's no law, there is no sin. Well, we know from the very beginning, as man fell from grace, that there was sin. And so just a natural deduction would be that if there was sin, there had to be a law. And there had to be a breaking of that law for there to be sin. Genesis 4:7 gives us the experience of Cain and Abel. Cain, of course, was very upset because Abel had brought the right sacrifice before the Lord, and his sacrifice was accepted. Cain's, of course, was not, because Cain brought something before the Lord that was not what the Lord had prescribed. Genesis 4:7 tells us, the Lord is speaking to Cain. He says, "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door." And so we see very clearly that the word sin is found in the Bible, and therefore we must deduce that the law existed at that time as well. Genesis 26:5, speaking of Abraham, tells us, "Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." And also in Genesis 39:9, speaking of Joseph, as he was tempted by Potiphar's wife, it says, "My master has withheld nothing from me except you," speaking of Potiphar's wife, "because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Now how would Joseph have known that it was a sin to commit adultery with Potiphar's wife had he not known some sort of law that was given from God? And I believe very strongly that the Ten Commandments were actually passed down from God's people up into the point of their slavery in Egypt. And during that period of time, I believe that the people began to forget and began to put away all the previous knowledge they had of God. And of course, as generations died off, that knowledge became less and less of the Creator God. And therefore, when you find God bringing them out of Egypt, he is reestablishing, if you will, his law with them. It's kind of interesting, as you look at the character of God, and you also look at God's law, you find exactly the same characteristics between the two. And I'm putting a slide up on the screen here that shows you that every time it says something specifically about God's character, you find the exact same description about God's law. And so you can no more do away with God's law than you can with God's character. And the Bible is clear that the Lord does not change. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So what is truth as we look at truth in the Bible? Well, we find three things. Jesus, in John, the 14th chapter in verse 6, that he is truth. The second thing we find is that his word is truth. John 17:17. And also we find that his law, God's law, is truth as well. And that's found in Psalms 119 and verse 142. And so you cannot do away with truth. It's absolute. It will always exist. And you cannot do away with truth any more than you can do away with those three things. We're still trying to answer the question, did the law or the Sabbath, even more specifically, exist before the Ten Commandments were given? Well, there's another pretty good example as we find Moses leading the people out of Egypt. We find that in Exodus chapter 16 and verse 4, that something very special happened ever before the law was even given. Exodus 16 verse 4, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not." So here we have God's law existing before it's given, and something very interesting about this 6 days and then the seventh resting. Exodus 16 verse 5 says, "And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Then Moses and Aaron," in 16 and verse 6, "Then Moses and Aaron said to all the children of Israel, At evening you shall know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt." Exodus 16 verse 21, "So they gathered it every morning, every man according to his need. And when the sun became hot, it melted. And so it was," Exodus 16 verse 22, "and so it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses." Exodus 16:23, "Then he said to them, This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning." Then Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none." And so the people did just that. They gathered what they needed to. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much. And then on the 7th day, there of course was none to gather. Exodus 16 verse 28, the people had disobeyed his law and actually went out to search for the manna on the 7th day. "And the Lord said to Moses, How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws?" And again, we're going over this because it's important to note that these things existed and God was giving them to the people way before the 10 Commandments were officially given from Mount Sinai. Exodus 16:29, "See, for the Lord has given you the Sabbath, therefore he gives you on the 6th day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place, let no man go out of his place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel." And so then we have the experience of God giving the law to Moses after that time. But again, very interesting to note that the law, the commandments, seem to exist before that law was ever officially given at Mount Sinai. You know, it's interesting to note that the commandments were never meant to be burdensome. They were never meant to bring harm to the people, but rather protection. God was telling us not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to do these things to our fellow man, because it protects our relationship with our fellow man. Just like the first 4 commandments protect our relationship with God. And so in no way were these commandments ever meant to be burdensome or to take away our freedoms in life, but rather to preserve our freedoms in life by keeping the law of God. "Happy is he who keepeth the law of God," it says in the book of Psalms. And so as we look at the law, we never want to look at it from a legalistic perspective, saying that we have to do this or we have to do that or we can't do this. That's not at all how God meant for his law to be kept. He meant for it to be a joy, he meant for it to be a pleasure and a life-giving principle that would add. Jesus said that he came to give life and life more abundantly. And he also said that he has loved his Father and kept his Father's commandments. And he also says to us, "If you love me, keep my commandments." So just keep that in mind as we move through this study, that in no way are we trying to talk about legalism here, but rather a loving the Lord. We love the Lord and we want to do what he has called us to do. Now what about someone who's